Again, I'm not going to do a big introduction. Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh. Lorraine is an environmental psychologist at Cardiff and director of the new Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. Again, you can read more about Lorraine in your programme. Lorraine.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. So I was asked to talk about sort of the theme of the conference around kind of crossing boundaries, and I wanted to talk a bit about the work that we're doing and the broader field is doing around participation in relation to climate change research and policy. And I first of all wanted to situate it in the context of what I think is a kind of broader sort of shift towards being more participatory, both within science, including social science, and policy. And so taking science, first of all, I think it's fair to say we can no longer say that scientists or social scientists have a monopoly on truth. I think the spotlight has been turned on the scientific processes and opening up the black box of science to see really what goes on in terms of kind of constructing knowledge within science and showing it to be an imperfect process. And recently, within psychology, we're particularly kind of concerned about what's been termed the reproducibility crisis. The fact that, in fact, over half of the classic psychological studies, which showed, sort of phenomenon that we've been led to believe were kind of real sort of psychological phenomenon, couldn't actually be reproduced, or where they were, the effect sizes were very much smaller. So it does kind of, we've started to sort of have this sort of self-critical look at the way in which we're doing social science and science more generally. And also at the same time, of course, as we heard this morning, there are obviously, we've known for a long time that the way in which the public and non-experts think about risks is often different to the way in which experts think about risk. And while we could conclude that maybe that just means that the public is wrong or misinformed, and so we should raise awareness, actually what a lot of the evidence shows is that really what it comes down to is different worldviews and different values, and actually that that's why we're seeing kind of a backlash against some of the kind of technical conclusions about certain things like GM food being safe or fracking being safe. And the public and communities saying that they don't accept that it is safe. And what that comes down to is not necessarily a disagreement, a misunderstanding of the kind of facts, but actually different values and worldviews around what do we consider to be what do we value, and therefore what do we consider to be safe in those terms. And so there's this shift towards kind of the idea of democratizing expertise and reducing the distance between experts and non-experts, and sort of valuing the role that citizens can play in actually collecting data, analysing data, co-production models, something we heard about in the participation session before lunch. And so really recognising the diverse range of expertise that exists outside of research. And one of the frameworks in which kind of this is discussed is post-normal science. So Funtwitz and Revetz acknowledged that there was a sort of increasing sort of set of conditions in which traditional scientific models weren't really adequate, that us just doing our research sort of in our ivory towers or whatever, and then kind of applying it and giving it to potential research users didn't necessarily work. And they talked about this idea of post-normal science as applying where facts are uncertain, where values are in dispute, where the stakes are high and decisions urgent. And they said that we need to be much more participatory, consultative, and engaging with potential research users or those that might be affected by research right from the very beginning of scoping out the research process throughout the process. And this kind of relates to ideas around transdisciplinarity. So if interdisciplinarity is working across disciplines, transdisciplinarity is going beyond research and science to actually engage with non-academic or non-research communities, bringing in kind of lay expertise or stakeholder practitioner knowledge and so on. And so these conditions of kind of where post-normal science is thought to apply really kind of fit very well with climate change, so the area that I'm working in. Because as Mike Hume has argued, climate change is very much an issue which is complex. I mean, it involves understanding not just natural systems and how they kind of evolve over long periods of time and globally, but also the interrelation with social systems. So that's kind of all disciplines together, so a huge amount of kind of relationships and complexity. It's an issue which is ambiguous and uncertain in many ways. We don't necessarily know that, how different areas will be impacted. We don't know that necessarily how decisions taken today will affect climate change in the future. And in many ways, it's kind of subjective. So as he argues in his book, the reasons we disagree about climate change, again, are not necessarily down to some people not understanding the science and other people understanding the science, but it's about people having very different views and values relating to, well, equity, about consumption, about quality of life, about our relationship with the natural world, and so on. So all of those sorts of things, how we understand society, how we understand the natural world, all are impacted by climate change and thinking through the implications of climate change. And so that's why it's an issue which is very contentious. And alongside the sort of participatory turn within science itself, there's also been a sort of shift towards recognising the value of participation in policy making and decision making. And Fiorino says that there are three rationales for participation in policy making. One of them is a normative one, that is to say, well, it's the right thing to do, especially where people are being affected by the decisions that you're making. So in a democracy, we should listen to what people think when we're designing our policies. The second one is an instrumental one, and there are different aspects to this. From a sort of quite cynical point of view, well, if you just want to sort of look good, if you want to improve your reputation, you should at least sort of have the appearance of listening to people and consulting people. But actually, as well, there's an element which is that by involving people, particularly from the earlier stage in the policy-making process, you can actually kind of persuade them and you get their buy-in to what is ultimately the decision. So actually you can build trust and potentially head off some of the opposition that you might have seen had you not engaged people through that process. The third rationale then is a substantive one, which is actually there's evidence that the more diverse forms of expertise and different perspectives that we can bring into policy making, the better the decisions. So by bringing in a range of different views, we can actually improve the quality of decisions. So arguably, more participatory decision making leads to better and fairer decisions. And fairness is also very important because what we know from the evidence base about policy acceptance is that perceived fairness is one of the strongest predictors of policy support. So the more people think that a policy is fair, the more they're likely to support it. And part of that is about procedural fairness, that actually the process of developing a policy has consulted with everybody that's likely to be impacted, that it's people have had an opportunity to have their say, and that the impacts of the policies are fair on different groups and people aren't unfairly disadvantaged. So if we want policies to be accepted, including climate change policies, we need to be kind of listening to people and the concerns they might have. And arguably that's why we saw some of the protests in France around the carbon taxes, because I think there wasn't a recognition that actually what was fundamentally the problem here was around kind of justice and equity, and that certain people were going to be unfairly disadvantaged by these taxes. So it wasn't a protest about wanting to tackle climate change, particularly. It was much more around a kind of an equity concern. So involving people at the earliest stage can help bring people on board and avoid these kind of protests. Now, I've mentioned that one of the reasons that we'd want to kind of involve people in decision-making is if they're going to be impacted by a policy. And climate change as an issue is something which, of course, we're all going to be affected by. We're already starting to be affected by it, and changing weather conditions, extreme weather events, and so on, and impacts on kind of infrastructure, food systems, and so on. But not only are the impacts going to be increasingly felt across society, but also policies to tackle climate change are going to be impacting on everybody as well. And so about a year ago, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, produced a 1.5 degree report spelling out that actually if we are going to have any chance of avoiding the most dangerous impacts of climate change, we need to take really radical and transformative action to tackle climate change in quite a short period of time. So in the next decade, we need to halve our emissions. We need to be at net zero by 2050 at the very latest. So that means really radical transformation of society. And the UK Climate Change Committee earlier this year actually looked at the type of measures that we'll need to put in place if we're to get to net zero. And they kind of divided up the measures into technological, which is the red slice of the pie, and then measures which involve, at least to some degree, societal or behavioural change. And so you can see together the blue and green bits of the pie comprise the majority. So actually most of the measures that we're going to need to put in place to tackle climate change will impact on the way in which we live our lives in quite profound ways. And that suggests we need to be engaging with people because, as I said, from a normative point of view, we need to be actually talking to people about do they accept the policies that we're talking about to reach a 1.5 degree future. That is to say, limiting the extent to which global warming happens so we don't experience the worst effects. But that means that actually we're going to have to do things like significantly reduce the amount of meat and dairy that we eat, that we're going to have to drive and fly very much less, that we'll have to adopt new technologies, that we'll have to consume less stuff in general, that we might have to borrow more stuff as opposed to own stuff. So that's a picture of a toy library there. So shifting towards more shared ownership models. So really, some of the proposals are very radical in terms of thinking about the structure of society, around our ideas, around really how we live our lives. Or we could go down business as usual, let's live our lives as we are and do what we want to do, but then living in a much more dangerous world. And so we need to have a debate about to what extent, which of these sort of futures do we want and how do we want to get there. From a normative point of view, but also, as I've mentioned, substantively, it improves the quality of decision making. It leads to more workable policies if we listen to people. And also there's evidence it builds political mandate. It actually gives policymakers the justification for taking action if you can show there is public support for those policies. So in this context, it's quite interesting that the UK Parliament recently announced that they're going to be doing a climate change citizens' assembly. And so the UK Climate Assembly will be launching next month and taking place over 4 weekends up until late March. And this will involve 110 members of the UK public, randomly selected, so they are supposed to be representative of the UK, listening to evidence about climate change and really getting to grips with the details of all the different policy proposals and ways in which we can reach net zero. And those recommendations that come out of those discussions will then go back to the 6 parliamentary select committees that commissioned that assembly. So this is the sort of thing, and we're also seeing, by the way, that these sorts of more participatory models happening at local level as well. A number of different city councils are doing similar sorts of citizens' assembly, citizens' juries to really open up discussion around how we tackle climate change. In our centre, the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, we're really interested in the whole range of different roles that people can play in a transition towards a low-carbon, sustainable society. And I've just talked about the kind of role that people might play as citizens, so having a say in the policies that are put forward to tackle climate change. But obviously people are also consumers. They can buy different things or fewer things. They can travel and eat in different ways. They may be parents. They may be members of communities. They may be employees, employers, decision makers with quite senior positions and so on. So all of these kind of different roles that people can play This is what we want to kind of understand, how people exert influence, how they can actually act as agents of change in tackling climate change to both directly and indirectly reduce emissions, so across these different scales. And so in some of the work that we're doing, and just to give you a couple of examples, the way that we've structured our research programme is that we have 4 themes, but just looking at 2 of them. The first one, we're doing, we've sort of called it the visioning theme, basically, but this is where we're really looking at what should a low-carbon society look like. And so here we're conducting a range of different participatory exercises, so deliberative workshops with the public, with a range of different stakeholders, to look at, say, the future of food, the future of mobility, and so on. And what do people want from a future society? And what do they think of different policy options to achieve that? Alongside that, there is scenario work, modelling work that is feeding in to inform those discussions. So it's the expert elements are kind of feeding into the deliberative discussions as well. And that's really forming the kind of normative direction of our centre. So we're really trying to embed kind of public values and views from the outset in terms of the design of the rest of the work that we do. One of the other themes is also learning from past transformations. So together with the visioning work, those 2 sort of foundational elements are then feeding into a more kind of action research piece of work, which is really a set of projects which looks at how can we deliver emission reductions across the different scales of society. So from the individual and household level, through communities and organisations, to the city level and national level. And so here, again, we're working in a participatory way because we're working with private, public and third sector stakeholders to actually co-design and co-deliver interventions that draw on this foundational work and then actually kind of apply that in terms of interventions to try and change behaviour, change organisations and so on. Just linking this then to what we know works, in some of the previous work we've done, we know that actually if we do build our interventions on what people value, what they care about, they generally work better than if we just kind of come up with an idea and apply it irrespective of kind of maybe what the audience thinks. This is an example of some simple framing studies that we did a few years ago, where we wanted to compare different ways of talking about climate change to different audiences. And so we disaggregated our participants according to their political ideology. So the green bars are the sort of left of centre, the pink are the kind of centre to centre right, and then kind of further right are the blue bars. And we gave them three different, or they were randomly assigned to 3 different versions of a text that described action to tackle climate change. The justice one was one where we really talked about kind of it's only fair that people in kind of developed countries do more to tackle climate change because they've been more polluting. The richer people are generally more responsible for causing climate change, so they should do more. And unsurprisingly, the people on the left of centre rather liked that argument. It appealed to their values. So we saw higher article agreement amongst that group and lower as you move further right. We had a narrative or a framing that was around kind of what we call Great British Energy, which was kind of talking about the opportunities for business and kind of self-sufficiency to produce our own energy. And again, we saw kind of smaller differences here, but a slight preference towards the left. And then the waste narrative was one where we talked about it's important not to waste energy. It only makes sense to kind of draft-proof your house and not throw away energy, etc. And there we saw the polarisation kind of more or less disappear. And actually, it had quite a universal appeal. I realise those bars don't look very different, but they were significant differences. And this kind of reflects the fact that actually generally climate change is something which is quite politically polarised. So the left of centre generally are more engaged, more willing to take action, and the further right you go, there's generally more scepticism or apathy. So we started to see just the beginnings of actually even just tweaking a few words in the way we talked about climate change could make some significant differences to the way people felt about climate change and the extent to which they were sceptical. So designing communication around your audience's values is just one example of how you can actually more effectively engage people. But of course you can go beyond that, because we know information alone is often not necessarily the most effective way we can change behaviour and engage people, though it may be part of the solution. But just to give you one other example, this is work that the charity 1010, or as they've now recently rebranded Possible, have done in recent years, their Solar Schools project, where they engaged dozens of schools across the country to actually actively raise money, get involved in actually understanding the energy used within their schools, and it led to over 2,000 solar panels being installed in a number of different schools, so significantly cutting carbon and the energy bills of the schools, so there was kind of a win-win outcome. And what was a really important lesson here, and we're working with Possible as well in the centre to build on this, is that part of the success of this is because it was very participatory. It involved the schools themselves being active right from the outset in designing what they wanted to do, how they wanted to do it, and so on. And then they were given the tools to do that. And more generally, we know that actually from research on behaviour change interventions, the more you can involve participants in the design of the intervention, actually them having the autonomy and coming up with the goals that they want to achieve as a result of a particular intervention, the more effective that's likely to be. So yeah, just from in terms of a kind of efficacy point of view, it makes sense to be more participatory. The final thing I just wanted to say is around reflexivity. So I think the more that we've opened up kind of science to realise that it is very much a social process, the more it's kind of shed light on the limitations of what we do and forced us to kind of reflect on our role also as advocates, you know, the fact that we're not just neutral bystanders, that maybe we have a role to actually play in achieving change as well. So there's been quite a lot of discussion in our research area about what's the role of researchers in a climate change transition. And a lot of soul searching, because researchers often like to travel to conferences and fly to sort of exotic places to see the world as part of going to conferences and conducting research, having meetings and conducting field work and so on. So it's kind of, we've started to realise that actually we're pretty high emitting people just in the course of our own research. And there was a study not long ago that showed that actually climate scientists who reduce their carbon footprint are seen as more credible, and they're more likely to inspire behaviour change amongst non-scientists. So if we want to be advocates, if we want to advocate for action on climate change, arguably we do need to be walking the talk and actually reducing our carbon footprint. Rather depressingly then, some analysis that we've just done suggests that actually climate change researchers fly more than any other type of researcher. So this is, I'm already anticipating a Daily Mail headline here, but so this bar chart shows, well, I've called it expert and non-expert. Essentially, we did a big international survey of academics, and we disaggregated them into the green bars are people that, as a significant part of their research, they study climate change or sustainability. And then the pink bars are any other academic discipline. And we had a whole range of different disciplines. And although, again, the differences are not huge, they are significantly different for domestic flights and for intercontinental flights. So climate change researchers fly more domestically and for intercontinental trips than people who study other disciplines, which is rather depressing. We also found, incidentally, that the more senior you are, the more you fly. So the people that arguably know the most on the planet about climate change, so professors of climate change, are the ones that fly the most. So, yeah, I think this has caused us to reflect even more on the role that we might play in a climate change transition, the fact that we need to decarbonise our research, we need to walk the talk. So kind of bringing this together then, I think there are lots of reasons why we might want to bring participation into our research and into policy around climate change. Climate change is an issue which is complex, it's value-laden, tackling it requires radical social change, and so I think public participation is all the more vital in this area than maybe in many others. And so really, if we sort of think about what democratising expertise might mean then, I think that involves collaborating with the public and stakeholders right from the outset of the research that we're doing. So actually defining our research agenda in collaboration with the public, thinking about what does a low-carbon society actually look like, for example, testing out and evaluating low-carbon solutions, so working with people that might have practical expertise to deliver these interventions, and then also being reflexive and self-critical and actually thinking, well, can we do better ourselves in terms of changing our own behaviour? And we've embedded co-production in a number of ways. I've just talked about a couple of them here. Within our centre, we've got things like citizens panels that actually are going to be shaping our work. We've got funding that we give out directly to stakeholders and community groups to actually deliver and design interventions themselves, and so on. So I can talk more about that if you're interested. But I think it's about really thinking about new ways of doing research that actually involve people in a number of different ways. So yeah, leave it there.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the questions that have already come in. You were sparking the questions even as you spoke, Lorraine. The first one is, I'm just going to read out because it's actually almost identical to the question that I would have asked. So, which is about talking about the public. That implies everyone, but only a few, of course, will take part. For example, you were talking about public and deliberative stakeholder workshops. How can you make the process representative? And I would add, as a statisticians spend their lives worrying about representativeness. So how much does it matter?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. So there are things that you can do to design the process to ensure that you get the sort of harder to reach groups. In the UK Climate Assembly, for example, it's a civic lottery that is used to ensure that it's a completely random selection of the public. I think 30,000 invitations went out, from which they're trying to draw a sample of 110 people to take part. So you have to, there is an element of voluntarily agreeing to go along, but what they're trying to do is ensure that it's demographically representative, and also representative of the climate change attitudes of the nation. So one of the things they look at is trying to match the percentage of the sample that's taking part with previous and recent surveys of the UK public to ensure that there's, the right percentage is very concerned about climate change, somewhat concerned, etc. So they're trying to map a number of different criteria to the sample. Of course, people are paid as well to take part. So it's not that you're getting people that necessarily have a very strong view about climate change, though that might be some of what appeals to people for taking part. So there seem to be, we're working with Involve, who's an organisation that does a lot of this work. There seems to be a number of rationales for taking part, and not only an interest in the issue per se. I think it's always going to be difficult because then you have your 110 people in the room, and whether those people, once they've gone through that process of really engaging with some very technical information, out the end, they're almost experts themselves. So in that sense, they become less representative. But there's also a kind of communications and engagement infrastructure that sits around the process so that the broader public can also see, they have access to all the information that's shared, they can kind of see how the decisions were reached, etc. So it's a very transparent process. But I think always the challenge is kind of breadth versus depth. So in that case, you've got the real depth of engagement, getting to grips with the details of kind of climate change, pros and cons of different policies. And so you've got incredibly informed opinions that come out the end. The alternative is you maybe do kind of a survey, but you really only get kind of a very superficial view of and that hasn't really necessarily been formed on the basis of information about different policy options. And there are kind of middle grounds, I think, of how to do more online democratic things, which I'm, by the way, going to the session later, so I hope to learn more about.
Okay, thank you. And the next one I'm going to pick up is, in those processes, do you explicitly include climate change deniers? And if you do, is that helpful?
Excellent question, and I wondered that myself when I got involved. So the fact that they ensure that there is representation of different climate change views means that you will get skeptics taking part. Where this has been done previously, apparently what tends to happen is that those people, because they're shown the same amount of evidence, they're shown and they're exposed to discussions by the broader kind of group, actually very often skepticism does reduce as a result of participating in that process, actually. I mean, it is always possible that they just drop out and say, I don't want to have anything to do with this. But actually, it seems that more often than not, they kind of convert as a result of going through it. So I think that's an interesting... I mean, you are trying to get the diversity of values and views in the room, so...
Let me just add to that. I've seen it in practice, actually, a project I was involved in some years ago, which was about... Heathrow expansion, very, very strong views on both sides. And for the first time ever, they were brought together in a room, which, I thought I was going to have a tin hat and duck. But actually, it was the process itself that led to a much more effective dialogue and discussion than I think either group had before. Let me pick up another one on reflexivity. Let me phrase it the way that I want to phrase it, which is that, again, some work that I've been involved in suggests that the people, scientists, we know this, Ipsos, did surveys of trust. Scientists are quite well trusted, except when they're seen to have a vested interest. And again, I've seen research that says scientists speaking for big charities who are presenting perfectly respectable scientific evidence, if it then has a sting in the tail, which is, and donate here, then the whole credibility is undermined. How does your finding, you talked a bit about this, how does that kind of role of the researcher as both advocate and as independent voice, how does that play out?
I think this is something we're really grappling with ourselves. I think it is a sort of balancing act, because it's I think we're in the fortunate position that the overwhelming evidence now around climate change is that it's happening, it's serious, people are dying, and it's going to get worse unless we do something. So in that sense, it's a bit like kind of smoking, that there's kind of an agreement we have to do something about it. So that part of it is not very contentious, I think, actually just saying we need to do something about climate change. So in that sense, I think all of us are kind of agreed that that's an important role that we need to play. But I think we need to sort of stop short before we sort of say specific kind of policy recommendations. We can spell out pros and cons of different policies, and it's important then to have that debate and open it up to discussion. So I hope that doesn't then challenge too much our credibility. I think we retain some independence then, but I think there's still a role to sort of say we need to do something.
Okay, and then finally, this is one for you personally. Are you, or have you gone full Greta Thunberg and started sailing to conferences?
Sailing. I just try not to go to North America. I've started saying no to quite a lot of things, and going by train wherever I can. The one exception, ironically, is that I recently joined the IPCC, and they like to have meetings in very far away places. So the only flights I've taken have been for IPCC meetings.
Thank you for your honesty. And just on that slide, which prompted that question, of course, climate change is genuinely global. So people are going to want to have a global perspective. A lot of the things that we research have a very much either regional or even domestic or local set of interests. So I wasn't really surprised by that. But thank you very much for your presentation. Lots of other questions, which again will be captured. So thank you.